I think I'm going to begin. So welcome. We'll let people kind of trickle in, move to other rooms. You can always hop from room to room, everyone, if you need to. And yeah, so I'm Pippa, or Philippa Domville. I'm an ARCA member. I'm an actor and a choreographer. And I choreographed a big flash mob that you'll see. Thank you, Malusha. It's about the ASL that you'll see at the very end of our day. We have some clips from that. So I'm really actively involved in thinking about how to employ dance and movement in climate actions. And I want to welcome you to our session on energy. And I have the great pleasure of introducing you to Dale Marshall from Environmental Defence Canada. And he's going to guide us through our conversation on energy. Dale has over 20 years of experience working on environmental protection, primarily working with Environmental Defence Canada. He primarily works on climate change and energy issues. He also spent 2 years in Cambodia, building the capacity of local NGOs to integrate climate change resilience and adaptation into their programs. With environmental defense, Dale works to move Canada to greater action on climate change, a phase out of fossil fuels such as oil, coal, and fossil gas, and the development of a fair transition for workers and communities. And before I hand it right over to Dale, I just want to let you know that we have a good chunk of time after Dale speaks for questions. So please do put them in the chat and not the Q&A, just to keep things simple. I'll do my best to share them. And Dale's going to use some images, a little bit of PowerPoint. When he does that, if you want to have it on full screen, you just hover your cursor over the image and there's 3 little dots that will show up. You can actually do it to me right now if you want, or Dale right now. 3 little dots show up on the right-hand side. You click on that and it gives you the option to go to full screen. And yeah, over to you, Dale. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Pippa. Thanks for joining us today. I'm really excited about this. I, obviously care a lot about action on climate change, and talking to the theater community sounds amazing to me. So I'm excited to give a presentation. I'm going to spend maybe half the time, maybe 15 to 20 minutes, giving a presentation, and then I'd love to have a discussion and answer questions, but also I'd love to hear from you in terms of your thoughts. And so I'm going to share my screen now. Let's hope this works. All right. So can you see that?
I certainly can. Let us know in the chat. Yes, great. Thank you, Malusha. Thank you, Jeannie.
Yeah. So I'm Dale Marshall, Environmental Defense, and climate change is one of those things that inspires both hope and fear. And so I'm going to play with that a little bit today and hopefully provoke some discussions. So what I'd like to do actually to start is I'm just going to take 1 minute and not talk and allow each of you to write down one thing that gives you hope about climate change and one thing that makes you scared about climate change. And we'll revisit those at the end if that's possible. So I'm just going to not say anything for a little bit and give you that chance. Okay, hopefully that was enough time, but you can keep mulling that over as I talk as well. I often show this slide at the beginning of presentations because it really highlights the fact that action on climate change is actually a solution, not just to saving the planet for our children and grandchildren, but it also solves a whole bunch of other problems that we have in the world. And I'll be talking more about these. So I'll start with the Paris Agreement. This was a global agreement that was struck by all the countries of the world. And basically the ultimate objective of the Paris Agreement is to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius and strive for 1.5 degrees. And, you know, those temperatures may not mean much in terms of average warming because they seem small, but there's actually a really big difference between 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees. And I'll get into that in the next slide, but also talk more about what's needed to actually limit the average warming to those temperatures. So the reason that we need to use 1.5 degrees as our threshold, as the threshold, is because impacts continue to rise as temperatures rise. We've already warmed the planet a little bit more than 1 degree and are facing the impacts of that. The impacts will continue to accelerate through 1.5 degrees. And the difference between 1.5, the impacts that we feel as the planet warms from 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees are actually really significant. So you have 2 to 3 times the loss of species. You have entire ecosystems like coral reefs that go from maybe 70 to 90% gone to completely gone when the temperature rises to 2 degrees. Extreme heat events go up. And important for a lot of people is literally hundreds of millions of people in the world, or additional people, are going to live in poverty as temperatures move that 0.5 degrees. It's because of a lack of food, because of a lack of water, displacement because of extreme weather events like more intense hurricanes. And of course, many more species and even ecosystems will disappear. And so to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, this is the UN body that includes hundreds of climate scientists, they have said that essentially over the next 10 years, that global carbon dioxide emissions have to go down by 45%. That's globally. For industrialized countries like Canada, that actually means we have to go more quickly. We have to go first and fastest. And the reason for that is because we are responsible for the problem of climate change. Industrialized countries have largely filled up the atmosphere and taken up a lot of that carbon budget while we industrialized. And now there's not room for poor developing countries to follow the same path. And we also have accumulated wealth by doing that. And so we have the resources to do much more and more quickly in terms of reducing our carbon emissions. So for Canada, this is a graph that was developed by Climate Action Network and some of its members, including Environmental Defense, that basically shows what has to happen between now and 2030 for Canada to do its fair share of the burden of action on climate change. So 45% is the global reduction that's needed by 2030. For Canada, the total fair share is actually 140% reductions. And for those of you who are good with math, we know we can't reduce more than that. But the full fair share is 140%, which means we have to do part of that domestically. And then we have to invest in emission reductions in other parts of the world, a lot of it in the developing world, in order to further reduce emissions. And so it's somewhat arbitrary, but as a network of more than 100 groups, we've said that Canada should be reaching at least 60% emission reductions domestically for Canada. So the path to getting generally for any country, this is essentially the solution to climate change. You make everything more energy efficient, so it doesn't need nothing needs as much energy to run: cars, homes, buildings, industries. You electrify everything, and that electrifying everything for the most part means getting off of fossil fuels. So using ground source heat pumps for buildings instead of natural gas for heating, for example, using electric vehicles for transportation instead of internal combustion engines, switching industrial processes so they use electricity instead of coal. And then you power all of that with renewable energy. That is obviously a simplified path, but that is what is needed in order for us to phase out fossil fuels. And that is, fossil fuels are the cause of climate change. And therefore, the solution to it is to move away from them gradually over time and replace that with renewable energy that doesn't pollute the atmosphere. I mean, we need to get real about where Canada stands in terms of action on climate change. We're undeniably a laggard. So amongst the G7, our peer countries in the industrialized world, we're the only country who's, and I use GHG as a shorthand, those are greenhouse gas emissions or carbon emissions. We're the only country whose carbon emissions have increased since the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015. Canada also has the weakest target for 2030, right? It was strengthened a couple of times this year. Our goal is now to reduce emissions by 40%. Remember, I said our fair share is 60%. Other countries, the US has said at least 50%. Other countries are much higher. UK is talking about reducing emissions by 78% by 2035. We also give the lowest amount of financial support for poor developing countries to address the impacts of climate change and to undertake the kind of development they need that doesn't depend on fossil fuels. Where we are number one is in terms of giving subsidies to fossil fuels. And in Canada, that's mostly oil and gas. We give literally billions of dollars every year to the oil and gas industry at a time when we know what the solution is. It's to gradually move away from the use of fossil fuels like oil and gas. Pippa talked to me about one of the questions that may come up is, what's the barrier? What's the barrier that Canada has to face to deal with climate change? And it turns out I wrote and published a report for environmental defense. It's actually the single biggest barrier to climate action in Canada is the oil and gas lobby. And that's for two reasons. One is emissions continue to rise. So you can see from this graph that oil and gas and transportation are the two sectors whose emissions continue to rise. And you can see the projections going forward, where oil and gas is projected to continue to increase its emissions because it continues to increase its production. Whereas transportation looks like it will start to decline because cars are going to become more fuel efficient because of regulations, and also we're going to be moving towards electric vehicles. Other industries, including electricity and heavy industry, have reduced their emissions. And the second part of that is not just the emissions of the oil and gas industry, but it's also the influence of the oil and gas industry. The Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, so that's CAP, their wish list is for more LNG terminals, more oil and gas production, more pipelines, more subsidies. And basically we looked at their wish list that they put forward in the last federal election. And that would increase greenhouse gas emissions by over 100 million tons. And if that wish list was realized, the oil and gas industry alone, that makes up 7% of the Canadian economy, would use up 70% of Canada's greenhouse gas emission target. It also would constitute emissions that are higher than 170 other countries in the world. So a landmark study came out just two International Energy Agency. This is the leading international authority on energy and climate change. And its conclusion was, if we're going to, in fact, keep temperatures to 1.5 degrees, and we're going to reach net zero by 2050, that's be carbon neutral by mid-century, there needs to be no new oil, gas, or coal development. So no new fossil fuels at all. And we need to phase those out over time. And you say, okay, well, is that possible? And it entirely is. Because of this study showed, the International Energy Agency, this most recent study and others show that it is in fact possible. The graph that you see here are the costs of all of 2 different kinds of solar power and 2 different kinds of wind power. And you can see that the costs of those have been going down and are projected to continue to go down over time. Renewable energy is right now the cheapest option for 80 to 85% of new energy projects. And that's before you even consider all the pollution impacts of using fossil fuels instead. We already have the IEA's most recent report said that we already have the vast majority of technologies to reach net zero. 50% of them are completely viable right now, and almost the other 50% simply need for there to be cost improvements for them to play a part in that transition. And also, there are going to be millions of jobs that are going to be gained. There's going to be jobs that are going to be lost, of course, in coal, oil, and natural gas. But 9 million more jobs are going to be created as we shift towards renewable energy. The other important thing I want to stress is this is not about personal choices. The IEA's modeling shows that only 4% of the entire burden will come from you and I deciding to live differently. This is a systemic issue. It's about us being able to buy the right products when we go to buy a vehicle, buy a house, buy a stove. And this is about systemic changes. It's about ensuring that industry is doing its part. It's about collective action that comes through government policy. So even though you've been told for many decades now that it's about what you have to do, what your personal footprint is, the vast majority of this is going to happen through governments ensuring that industry and businesses do the right thing. And so we actually, Environmental Defense and a number of other groups actually did we commissioned some modelers, some economic and energy modelers, and said, hey, is it possible to get to 60%? How will we go about doing it? And the results, and by the way, a lot of these are in the package that was sent, a lot of these studies that I'm talking about. The result that we got was it's absolutely doable. It's challenging, it's really hard, but it's doable. And we're all better off for it. The economy and investment continues to grow. It grows more slowly than if we just invest in fossil fuels, but it continues to grow, and we see a transition away towards cleaner energy sources. And we have healthier communities, and we actually have lower energy costs. Again, that's because of the costs of renewable energy and other technologies, batteries and storage continue, and the cost of fossil fuels continue to go up. We're not going to pay for it from fossil fuels. This is just the only thing you have to look at in this graph is the purple line. That is the net worth of oil and gas companies in Alberta. And they are net negative in terms of their overall worth, their net worth, as of 2005, 2006, 15 years ago. And that's because the liabilities that they're producing in terms of pollution that needs to be cleaned up, oil and gas wells that need to be cleaned up, tar sands tailings ponds that need to be cleaned up, all of those, the liabilities outweigh what they're actually making. And in fact, since 2010, they're actually making a loss overall. They're not even making profits. Now, there's a differentiation between oil and gas projects that I won't get into. Some companies are making a lot of money and others are not, but overall, the industry is making a net negative profit. In other words, their losses. So what about jobs? What about communities? What about workers? So there's another study that we commissioned. We got a labor economist to take a look at what happens in fossil fuels if we phase them out over the next 20 years, so by 2040. And again, the conclusion is that a fair, gradual, and supported transition for workers and communities is possible. Part of that is because fossil fuels, this might be surprising, but fossil fuels, that's coal, oil, and natural gas, all across Canada, provide less than 1% of Canadian jobs. And if we phase out fossil fuels, the number of replacement jobs needed per year, that number of jobs is created every 5 days by the Canadian economy. Other larger transitions have happened in Canada. Other larger transitions have happened internationally. And between 2000 and 2010, the manufacturing sector downsized quite considerably. The size of the workforce that was integrated into the rest of the economy was twice as big. And that transition happened in half the time. And the other thing that might be surprising is that transition has already happened. It's already started to happen. Since 2014, the number of jobs that have been lost in oil and gas is 50,000 jobs. And that's because the work that is being done is increasingly being it's being replaced through technology, and also the price of the price of oil and the price of natural gas has plummeted that year, and therefore companies are finding as much as possible ways to get rid of the workforce. And so the same energy that went into replacing workers with technologies can be used to replace fossil fuels with renewable energy and the jobs that those create. This might be another surprise, is that organized labor is on board. Unifor is the union that represents auto workers and oil and gas workers. When we released our report that said that how we can reach 60% reductions by 2030, they supported that. They said in the media that they wanted greater ambition on climate change, but they also talked about making sure that the transition is supported. They know how to train workers. They understand that the workforce is aging and a lot of their members are going to be retiring, and they have the know-how to help with that transition. The worst thing we can do is just pretend that this transition isn't happening, and for it to be thrust upon us and thrust upon workers and communities. And so that's why I talk about transition. I talk about fair and supported through early retirement programs, through training programs, development programs that will help those communities that are overly dependent on fossil fuels right now. And then there are a whole bunch of benefits that come from climate action. Going back to that first slide, a whole bunch of research showing our communities are healthier. Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, CAPE, is an organization of doctors that pushes for climate action because they know that we will have healthier communities, healthier families. A recent Harvard study found that there are 9 million lives that are lost every year because of fossil fuels, mostly air pollution, but also other factors. As we phase out fossil fuels and move towards renewable energy, we will be saving lives. Also, greater racial justice. Again, all kinds of research, including Scientific American, showing that racialized communities are the ones who are more likely to be beside polluting industries like oil, like gas, like coal. And so again, moving away from fossil fuels allows for those communities to not keep facing the health impacts of living beside those industries. Oxfam found that the richest 1% of the people in the world are creating more carbon pollution than 80% of the world. If we move towards greater action on climate change, what happens? Though people who are overly polluting the world, a lot of the people who are wealthy are going to have to pay for a lot of that. And the people who are facing the impacts, those who are mostly in developing countries, but also in developed countries, again, in poor and racialized communities, they will benefit from not being impacted by the pollution and by climate change. We know that developing countries are facing the brunt of climate change as we speak. As the introduction said, I spent 2 years in Cambodia working with those that are impacted because of more severe droughts, more severe floods. I've been very fortunate, incredibly privileged to travel to many parts of the world, Central America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and be able to speak to people who are facing climate impacts and have been for a long time, and to completely understand how the climate has changed for them. And also, moving towards greater climate change means more livable communities. It means more compact communities. It means having access to transportation options that are sustainable. So there are a whole bunch of benefits from reducing our dependence on fossil fuels and moving towards climate action. So, going back to hopes and fears, I hope that this has been helpful for you to feel like we can do this. We have the solutions. We know what technologies and government policies work. It depends on us. And it's not because we're going to change our lifestyle. It's not because we're going to recycle more, or because our next vehicle is going to be electric. It's about engaging politically. Systemic changes are only going to happen through collective action, and that happens through our governments. So I'd like to ask now if I'm opening up for questions and comments, and part of those comments can be to tell me whether, what are your hopes and fears, and have they changed over the course of this presentation? I'm not assuming that I've been incredibly convincing, but I'd love to hear all of your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Dale. I'll start by saying that you have given me much more hope. I love seeing the nuts and bolts of possibility. And I thought maybe I'd just take 2 seconds, because we can't bring everyone up on the screen, which I wish we could. But I'm going to share the little bits of hopes and fears that people wrote, if this is helpful to everyone. So,
great.
Melanie, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Hope that there will be more equity for all people. Fear government not being accountable. Anita, hope, Green New World is possible. Fear, we are losing time with a pacified public. That's a huge one where we come in. Great. Thank you so much for those. Should I start throwing in some questions, I think, from the chat, because we've already got some really good ones. You know what? First, what I want to say, thank you so much for this. I love how you put it right off the top that our barrier, what's our principal barrier? Really being able to identify that for us. So if, as artists, we're messengers, we're propagandists for this swift change that has to happen, then what is the argument we have to make, to our audience, or to our families, or to our friends even? And right away you went to the oil and gas lobby. So I'm going to throw out there, anyone in the chat who has questions around that, what I want to ask is, what do you think, Dale, artists can do? Big question, but just from your experience as an act in your dream world, in your dream world of, we're all here, we're your army of propagandists. What could we do to help fight this, the oil and gas lobby?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that there's more of us who want to see action than those who don't, right? The vested interests are fewer, and they are powerful, though. And I mean, we have really seen a sea change over the last 2.5 years or so. So ever since that IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, came out, there's a sense of urgency in Canadians that I have not seen before. And so it's a matter of, I think seeing that reflected in our arts and culture and entertainment is really important. Seeing reality reflected in terms of our hopes and our fears around climate change is really important. And so, I'm obviously not an expert on arts and culture and theater, but like, people learn through storytelling. Like that's how people learn most. And you can see from my presentation, I'm not great at telling stories. I'm great
It
at
was
giving,
very clear.
I'm great at giving studies and facts, but storytelling is the way that people absorb things. And so that's the role of your community, is to tell stories about, I mean, yes, there are stories of devastation, but there are also stories of hope, like, renewable energy projects that are being built in indigenous communities, people who have decided to figure out a different way, and who have pushed back against corporate power. Like, there are a whole series of stories that can be told about about the journey that we're on. And I think I leave it to you to,
And I'm
but I
hearing that
also
a
have to
lot of
thank
it.
you for allowing me to bring information that then can be absorbed and used in whatever ways the creative people use it.
There's a lot of potential, wonderfully romantic David and Goliath stories that are
Absolutely.
already out there, right? That we
Absolutely.
can take on. Okay, I'm going to do some questions in the chat. Let's go to Sarah. Sorry, up here. Yeah, to Sarah. There are some of the oil and gas industry who are enthusiastic about conversion to renewables. Will there be a tipping point where oil and gas see only opportunities?
I mean, I think there will be. And hopefully it comes before they're forced to. So there was an environmental group that did a study of oil and gas companies and like what their plans were to get to, this notion of net zero, getting to zero emissions, and evaluated them. And there is one company in the world, British Petroleum, who is looking to actually reduce production of oil and gas. One. And so it is seeing the writing on the wall. It is saying, okay, we need to actually be producing less of this stuff, and we need to be shifting towards more renewables. I think that has started, but it's really, if we hear about it all the time in their commercials, but it's such a small part of their investment right now. And I think we will see a tipping point. And studies like the International Energy Agency's report that came out a couple of weeks ago, hopefully, will compel both those companies, but more, to be honest, I'm hopeful more for government policy, for all of us pushing government to force companies to do the right thing, rather than them seeing the light of day.
Good. And on that note of government, thank you. What would you say? Feel free right now, in the latest proposal from the Liberal government, the amount of spending and regulations, and including the carbon tax, what's sufficient and what's insufficient?
Yeah, I mean, look, the government has done a lot of really good things. You can see from the emissions trajectory that there are some sectors they're phasing out coal, right? That is in our electricity sector. That's why emissions from electricity have gone down, and why they're projected to continue to go down. That's a great thing. They understand that phasing out coal phasing out a fossil fuel is one of the solutions. And they have done that in a number of areas where they have made progress. And the two areas where we have not seen enough, again, one is in oil and gas. There has not been a reckoning with respect to increased oil and gas production, and therefore increased emissions. No government in Canada, it's not just the federal government, no provincial government has said we need to stop expanding these industries. And it goes across the political spectrum. And so that has to happen. And then we need to be much more serious about the transportation part of things. And another thing that's been avoided is making car companies make electric vehicles. The people want electric vehicles way more than they're being manufactured. And the solution is and other countries have done this. There are provinces that are doing this. They're saying, you have to produce a certain percentage of electric vehicles, and that percentage is going to keep going up until it's 100% electric. And the IEA's report said that has to happen globally by 2035. Again, for Canada, that means we have to go quicker. We should be doing that in the next 10 years. So like two big things, right? Transportation and oil and gas are the two highest and fastest growing emission sources. we need to tackle those first, and the government has not done that yet.
Thank you. There's so many more good questions. Can you quickly address nuclear? And then that'll be our last question. But I do want to say, anyone that's anxious about continuing this chat and this conversation, because it's huge and it's really at the center of things, we're going to send a big group email to all the attendees, and I'm going to host some informal Zoom meetings for those of you that want to share information, read the material that Dale will send us. I'll send it in the email, and we can continue this conversation. We'll make sure we keep we capture all of these questions in the chat. So the last one is nuclear. Because of Bill Gates coming out pro-nuclear, can you speak to nuclear as one of the clean options? Is it?
Well, I mean, to me, there are, I think, several reasons why we shouldn't be investing in nuclear, but I'll give you two. One is the waste that is, I mean, we're dealing with radioactive waste that has to be managed for literally hundreds of thousands of years. And so we're telling not only future generations, like thousands of future generations, that they have to deal with this nuclear waste pile, and we haven't even figured out how to do that yet. Secondly, and the most important one is it costs too much. Like I showed you, 80 to 85% of new electricity projects are, the renewable energy option is the cheapest of all of the options. Nuclear is even more expensive than fossil fuels. And so it just doesn't make sense from an economic standpoint to be investing in that. That doesn't mean we're going to shut down all the nuclear power plants tomorrow, but it means as they get to the end of their life, they need to be not refurbished, and we shouldn't be investing in new nuclear.
Thank you so much, Dale. I feel like we could talk for another 2 hours, or I could. I'm a big nerd about this stuff. Thank you all so much for coming. There's another session starting in about 5 minutes. So you can check out those sessions by clicking on the left, and we'll make sure that we just keep this conversation going. Thank you again, Dale.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm not sure what I do now.
Oh, well, you can leave if you want, and you can go to the afternoon session. And I'm just reading the chat for things that I want to try to write down. I'm going to capture it, but...
Well, thanks again to you and Soulpepper for putting this on. I think it's amazing.
Look, there's Christina said, the drive of a lot of my work with theater and climate action involves youth, both in co-creating the content and on stage, and perform for all generations. Amazing. Okay, great. We're going to capture that. 100watt.org. There's a lot of organizations here today. That's wonderful, Christina. Yeah. And Robin, I don't think we addressed your question on grids, but that's a really good question that we should.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, there are studies out there that explain this better than I could anyway.
Yeah, but I think it's in the package, right? That we might send.
I can try to add something on that. Yeah, I don't have anything now, but.
Okay, I'm trying to pull that up. Yeah, so Dale's question, I'll just get it right now. Nuclear option. Dale, can you talk about smart grids and energy storage? That was the one question we didn't get to, and that would be interesting. Is the debate on what people, and often right-wing people will say, just because they want to debunk everything, is what about the social cost and the environmental cost of mining for battery storage?
Oh, it's an issue.
It's an issue. Yeah. So you know what? It would be amazing if you have anything on that. We'll add it to our email, because I know I didn't attend to that question. And that would be great, because that can keep the conversation going on that. Because if we're making strong messages, we want to make sure that we're not lying and we're not fuzzing.
Oh, absolutely.
All of those questions. And really,
like I said, it's challenging. There are lots of challenges, and that's one of them. But it's worth doing.
It totally is. And the other big question that was excellent was, how do we become lobbyists? How do we directly? And that's something I think has come out of today. Is going, how do artists become lobbyists? How do we get right in there? And how do we combat the messaging? So but you've given us a lot of excellent messages. And again, all that material, there's a lot of buttons in there. There's a lot of quick, did you know, information that can be easily shared. even if it's just on our social media platforms. So Dale,
Yeah, I mean, for individuals, talk to your elected officials, talk to your MP, talk to your MPP. Like that, when they hear from you, it actually has a bigger impact than when they hear from me, because my bias is on my business card.
Right. Yeah. So listen to me.
Yeah. And also the 3-day sessions that you're giving, it very much feels like it's building towards that, right? Towards acting. And that a big part of that is communicating with people who are representing us in elected bodies.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I think that's going to come up, that we can both message to the voters, but we also want to get direct messaging to our leaders.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Dale, thank you so much. I'm going to hop into a session because there's a whole bunch of great sessions coming up.
Yeah.
So I want to hop into those. I feel like I want to continue this conversation. So thank you so much for all your work with environmental defense and for all that material as well.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for organizing this. It's great.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.